word about Frederic Bozo because he comes from a highly unusual background. And the best way I can explain this, I think, is to say that he comes in the same tradition of Stanley Hoffman of Harvard. This means that he is highly trained in the French tradition, and the French tradition of scholarship in this sense is quite different from the American, because the historian is not merely a historian, he is a humanist of all of the arts as well as a knowledge of the social sciences. So the highest compliment actually that I can pay to Frederic Bozo is that he follows in the footsteps of Stanley Hoffman. As you know, we begin by introducing ourselves. Could I ask you to identify yourself and to, let's say what is briefly preoccupying you at the present? It may be a chapter in a book. It may be foreclosure. Myself, I am trying to write a chapter on in a book about the 1967 war.
My name's Holly Galley, and right now I've recently learned that I'm being preoccupied with the historiography of the British Empire, as per Professor Lewis.
I'm Ryan Carpenter. I work at the Office of Secretary of Defense Historical Office, and I'm preoccupied with civil defense during the late 70s and 80s.
Hi, my name is Carl Ashley. I work at the Office of the Historian at the Department of State, and currently we are working on meeting the 30-year line for the publication of the Foreign Relations of the United States.
I'm Zed David. I'm a senior scholar here at the center, and I'm working on the philosophy of Thomas Masaryk.
I'm Mel Leffler from the History Department at the University of Virginia. Among other things, I'm thinking about the causes of the end of the Cold War.
Hi, I'm Steve Lipson from Catholic University of America. I'm right now working on a master's thesis on African American education in D.C. during the Progressive Era.
I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project, and I'm looking forward to a book launch next Wednesday on Parliament and Congress, and trying to find out whether Congress is really moving more in the direction of a parliamentary system.
I'm Eleanor Douglas. I'm working on my dissertation proposal, looking at the U.S. military assistance programs in the early Cold War period.
I'm Oksana Likarenko. I'm from Russia. I'm Kennan Institute scholar. I'm working on the U.S. policy towards the creation of common market.
Hi, I'm Ioana Toma. I'm a postdoc fellow, Romanian one, and I study Cold War propaganda on Radio Free Europe.
I'm Tom Adams, a retiree from NEH and senior scholar here, and I'm interested in Europe's welfare traditions, and I'm working on the more recent period now. Thanks.
I'm Rich Forsland. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I'm studying U.S. and European economic relations.
I'm Barbara Curli, Italian Fulbright Chair at the Georgetown University, teaching on U.S. and European integration.
I'm Maya Freudenbeck. I'm an intern of Professor Carruthers, who works on the USA as a military force in Germany.
Joseph Soon, Georgetown University, writing a book on the Ba'ath Party during Saddam Hussein.
My name is Gil-jae Ryu, professor of University of North Korean Studies in Seoul, and I'm working as a scholar for 1 year as regarding North Korea from the 1965 to 1975.
I'm David Nichols. I'm at the Historical Office of the State Department, and I'm working on U.S. East Asian relations during the late 70s.
Mircea Montano. I coordinate the Cold War International History Project at the Center.
I'm Sonia Michelle. I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Center. I'm working on a big project on global care chains, which doesn't sound very historical, but it's the last chapter or the most recent chapter in the long history of women migrating to do domestic work. And I should say, as a footnote, that I had the pleasure of becoming a comparativist of sorts, even though I'm an American historian, by participating in the Center for European Studies at Harvard under the brilliant and wonderful and generous direction of Stanley Hoffman. So I've experienced that breadth and capaciousness firsthand.
Hi, I'm Allison Lilakoff. I'm with the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center, and I just started a couple weeks ago, so I'm preoccupied with the process of acclimation.
I'm Will Amatruda, and I'll pass it along.
Thank you. My name is Kristina Terzieva, and I'm a program assistant with the History and Public Policy program.
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the center. I've been working on some fun new documents we got translated on the Polish role in Czechoslovakia in 1968.
I'm Susan Carruthers, a professor of history at Rutgers in Newark and a fellow here this year, and I work on the politics and practices of occupation.
I'm Martin Dimitrov, a political scientist from Dartmouth and a fellow here this year. I'm writing a book on why communism collapsed in Europe but survived in China.
I'm Albert Beveridge at Johns Hopkins, and this term I'm teaching history of environmentalism in the United States.
I'm Boris Lanin. I'm a professor from Moscow, and I'm Woodrow Wilson Center fellow. I'm writing a book on Russian education, and I remember very well that Russian reader was raised on French literature.
Okay, so I'm the only one left to introduce himself, and I'm also the one to welcome you here on behalf of the Wilson Center. My name is Bernd Schaefer. I'm a senior scholar with the Kohls Memoirs National History Project. And is it working? Yeah. And I'm substituting today in a way for Christian Osterman, who usually co-chairs these national history seminars. He is currently in Europe and sends his greetings. So I welcome you on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the program which is running this seminar, the HAPP, the History and Public Policy Program. And of course, I also want you to recognize the National History Center, which is itself an initiative of the American Historical Association, AHA, running these wonderful seminars here. And I also have to say that I have to give thanks to the support of Schaefer, of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. And I also have the privilege to introduce Frédéric Bozeau. I'm trying to pronounce some French terms, but I try to do my best. He's a professor of contemporary history and international relations at the University of Paris III, the Sorbonne Nouvelle. He's currently a Wilson Center public policy scholar, and I just heard he will be with us here for a full year, which is wonderful. He's the author of numerous books and articles on transatlantic and European security issues. And most recently, the topic also is going to talk about his book with Berkan in New York called Mitterand, The End of the Cold War and German Unification. He received his PhD in contemporary history from the University of Paris 10, Nanterre, and his habilitation from the University of Paris 3. He holds an agrégation degree in history and is an alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure, Harvard University, and the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. And currently at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar, he will work on French-American relations in the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And let me just finish with one anecdote before he actually will have his chance to speak for about 45 minutes before we have discussion for everybody here. I know him from conferences in Paris and in other places, and I think one of his most remarkable achievements is that he was able to hold pretty large, major international Cold War conferences in Paris in English, and getting support, I think, from the French Ministry of Education for an English language conference in Paris in a vernacular language like English, so it's really very remarkable. So glad to have you here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Bernd. Well, frankly, they can't fire me because I have tenure, so that's why I did this conference in English at the Sorbonne, but I know I was taking risks with some of my colleagues, but we did it. And thank you for attending that conference, Bernd. I'd like to thank Professor Lewis for having me here in his seminar, and also Christian Osterman. When both of them asked me to discuss the book, I was a bit reluctant because I had done so, frankly, here a few months ago, but I understand to a different audience. But then I convinced myself by remembering that what my old teachers told me way back, and that is that pedagogy is about repetition anyway. And as you will see, this topic needs a lot of repetition because the line is not one that is easily accepted by some. So I'm going to discuss the France's dilemmas faced with the end of the Cold War, based on my book, which appeared in 2005 in France and 2009 here in the US and in the UK. And since I understand that the seminar focuses on issues that are of interest, both in terms of history and politics and policy, in fact, I thought I would, as an introduction, make a few points that perhaps insist on that particular angle of my topic. Why is it politically important, or why do I think it is politically important or relevant? What is the political angle to this topic? And I see three points here, basically. One, obviously, is the contemporary relevance of the topic. 20 years after the fall of the wall and German unification, it's clear that we're still living in a world that is shaped by the decisions that were made back then. And crucially, we live in a Europe which is defined by the events of 89, 90, and how we ended the Cold War in Europe. And I think that French policy had a rather strong impact on that. Let me just give one illustration. It is impossible to understand the current state of the European Union, and in fact the very existence of the European Union, without looking at those events and those decisions. Simply because, in the positive sense, the very creation of the EU was the result, basically, of French-German interaction against the backdrop of the end of the Cold War and German unification. I mean, Maastricht is the result of Kohls and Mitterrand's understanding faced with the challenge of German unification. And of course also in the negative, because the current state of the Union can be explained by the sort of unfinished business of the time. Unfinished business in the sense of deepening of the Union. The reason the Union is not doing so well, and as we've seen during the financial crisis, is that it didn't become a federal state, a federal union, and that is to a large extent the result of the reluctance of the main players of the time, even Kohl and Mitterrand, to make a major step in that direction and to really decide to create an intergovernmental institution as opposed to a federal one. And also let's say the probably exceedingly rapid enlargement of the Union, which Mitterrand feared very much back 20 years ago, also has its effect today, as we've seen in many ways in the past few months. So there is a direct political relevance of these events for for Europe today, let's say. The second political angle in this history I would like to stress is and here I'm closer to my very topic, is the existence of a huge gap between what I've just said about the importance of these events and of France's role and Franco-German relations in that story, on the one hand, and the dominant narrative of these events and of the record of France in those events. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, France's role in the end of the Cold War and in German unification has been so far, at best, neglected in the literature, and at worst, caricatured and dismissed. The dominant narrative, until recently, has been one of a pure and simple French opposition to the end of the Cold War, whatever that means, as if it meant anything to be opposed to a historic event of that dimension. Can you be opposed to the thaw in the spring? Well, the dominant narrative is that France opposed those events, was wary of the thaw in Eastern Europe and of the democratization of the former Soviet satellites, that it tried to impede German unification, in fact to stop German unification by ganging up with the most vocal opponents to German unification, Mikhail Gorbachev and more importantly Margaret Thatcher, and that eventually Mitterrand even tried to stop the dissolution of the Soviet Union, quite an achievement for a single man. Now, this narrative has appeared very early on during the events, and gained power ever since. Now, I had thought that with the appearance of scholarly work and the opening of archives, on which I will speak in a minute, this narrative would recede, but not so. I think among scholars, it's understood that this is a very simplistic way of rendering the narrative, but in the wider public, and especially in the public debate, this line, this what I call the black legend of France's opposition to German unification, is still very present, very much present. And it is still a very political argument. Last year, the French Secretary for European Affairs, Pierre Lelouch, a former colleague, had the good idea of celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall in Paris. Very nice feast was put up to show how the French cared for Germany and German unification. That was a good idea, and the feast on Place de la Concorde was very pleasant on November 9th. It was less of a good idea for him, on his part, to explain that he was doing this as a gesture of excuse for the misunderstandings and the errors made by Mitterrand in 1989. And now was the time to heal those wounds. And of course, Sarkozy would succeed where Mitterrand failed, that is, in building a very strong Franco-German couple. Now we see the results of that. So it is still a very political argument, and I think this needs to be stressed here. The final political point, so to say, has to do with archives. Now, I'm humbled to have in this audience many people who know archives much better than I do, especially U.S. archives. But what strikes me after 20 years, and when looking at the emergent literature, is that the situation with regard to access to archives for that period is still very politically, let's say, influenced. If you look at the major sources of archives, of documentation from the major countries, you see this, I think, and it's still true. If you take the Soviet archive, it's very clear, and tomorrow I think Tom Blanton and Svetlana Sronskaya will discuss this here. But of course, the fact that the Soviet documents were probably the earliest documents available in the early 90s, of course, was a political, the reflection of a political fact, that is perestroika itself. And then, of course, after in the late 90s, the reverse happened under the late Eltsine and Putin. We witnessed a closing of those archives. So it was, it's clearly a very political process. In the U.S., of course, the first major scholarly work on the topic, that is Philip Zelikows and Condoleezza Rice's book of 1995, was impressive by the wealth of archival documents that they were able to use in their book of 1995. But of course, there was a problem, which is that they were the only ones able to do so. And at the same time, they were former members of the George H.W. Bush administration, which somehow contains a methodological contradiction. Let's put it this way. Now, ever since, of course, there has been a process of declassification through FOIA, and I must say I haven't spent very much time in the archives, in the American archives recently, but my impression is that this is still a rather piecemeal, let's say, access to original documents. Well, there are important documents coming to the surface, but we're nowhere near the kind of access that, for example, I had back 20 years ago when I was studying the history of 20 years before, that is in the 60s. 20 years before I was doing work at the Johnson Library or the Kennedy Library in the late 80s. The access I had to the documents of the late 60s was incomparably, I think, larger than one gets today for the late 80s or early 90s today. And of course, this has, I think, this accounts for a spin in the U.S. narrative, which is only beginning, I think, to wind down. And the spin was that of the Zelikow-Rice book, and that is basically we won the Cold War, even though, of course, it was much subtler than that, much more elegant and delicate than this. It really amounted to this. We masterfully managed the end of the Cold War and German unification, and we were a major engine behind that event. Well, this is beginning to be called into question, and Tom Blanton's introduction to the volume that they will present today, I think, is the first illustration of this. But still, there is spin. In Germany, there is spin. There has been a lot of spin. The situation is very comparable to the U.S. situation, with documents emanating from the Kohl Bundeskanzleramt, giving rise to a public volume of documents, but also to work by Weidenfeld and others. Clearly, Kohl wanted to be, for history, the Chancellor of Unity, and he did what had to be done in terms of managing access to archives for that to happen. This is beginning here again to change slowly. A new wave of books, such as Andreas Röder's book, which appeared last year, is beginning to be much more critical of that early presentation of things. And of course, access to archive is now wider. I understand the archives of the Auswärtiges Amt are becoming to be open, and hopefully the Genscher line, which is different from the Kohl line, will make its way through the literature. The UK, I don't need to dwell too long on this. It's also very political. The way the volume of documents appeared by the FCO appeared last year was very interesting in terms of spinning. Clearly, it's my interpretation, but I understand that I'm not the only one to share it. Clearly, the FCO was eager to come up with its own volume of documents and to show that all of British diplomacy was not as stubborn and blind as Thatcher was. And so it's a great opportunity for the FCO to convey a sense of, if not success in managing German unification, that would be too much to say, but at least of having played a reasonable role, constructive role, as opposed to Thatcher's Downing Street. And you can see that spin in the launch of that volume a year ago. Now, I would argue, and I will stop here on archives, that, and I know this is a line that is difficult for many people to accept, that there's probably less spin in the French sense, in the French case. And in fact, I would even argue that the present situation of access to archival documents in France on this period is probably better than anywhere else. The reason is the specific law on archives that exists in France, which was passed in 1979, and which it is not comparable to the US or the UK legislation, in the sense that it does establish a 25-year rule, as elsewhere, or 30 years elsewhere, but it does grant early access to documents, but not on an FOIA or declassification basis, but on an individual basis, given to individuals. Now, if you are a master's degree student, you won't get access. You have to be a little bit well-known, and so it's only established academics who get access, I have to confess. Now, the negatives, of course, negative side of this is that it's individual. That means that if someone gets access, it doesn't automatically give anyone else the access. But this has been compensated for by a policy on the part of the National Archives to actually consider that if X or Y has had access, then anyone can have access. And I'm glad to say that the documents that I've seen way back 10 years ago are now available, and someone like Mary Sarotti, in her latest book, 1989, has had access to the same documents as I. So progress is being made here. But altogether, the kind of access that you have to the French documents now on that period, including the publication online of many documents on German unification back in October of last year, as a response to the UK publication, a hasty response, I must say, to the UK volume, and the fact that the French diplomatic archives are now coming up with a volume of their own to appear, I think, later this fall, makes for a rather favorable situation in France, I would say. So, so much for the introduction and the political angle to this history. But I'll be glad to discuss these issues of archives later on if some of you are interested. What I want to do now is first take a quick look at why what I call the black legend of France's opposition to Germanification is so tenacious. Why Why do so many people still believe this? There are two, I would say, two series of factors. First, of course, as we say in French, there is no smoke without a fire. There is, of course, Mitterrand's policies back in 1989 and 1990, and the perceptions of those policies at the time. Now, to put it simply, part of the problem in today's bad reputation of Mitterrand's policies was that his policies on German unification, with regard to German unification, were not a simple copy of those of the other major players, including Germany, or at least I should say Kohl's Germany, because they were very near Genscher's policies. But they were not a simple copy of Kohl's Germany's policies, let alone of George H.W. Bush's policy. In terms of Kohl's policies, Mitterrand clearly did not share what Kohl seems to have been his early reflex, that is one of a quick German unification with little consideration for the international context. Mitterrand didn't like this, and he told him so. This probably played a role in the later misrepresentation of France's policy, because Kohl's narrative became dominant. And as a contrast, Mitterrand's policies were probably described by some Germans as negative, which they were not, because they were not the same approach to German unification, not exactly the same approach to German unification as Kohl. But again, Mitterrand saw eye to eye with Genscher on German unification. And you should never forget that the Germans themselves were not of one in complete agreement among themselves. With regard to U.S. policies, which is the other dominant narrative, of course, the U.S. narrative, I mentioned Zelikow and Rice, the difference between Mitterrand and Bush, between the French and the Americans, was that Mitterrand did not share Bush's priority in German unification, which was to make sure from very early on that German unification would occur within within NATO, basically, within NATO. Mitterrand's priority, as I will show you in a second, was not with NATO. It was with the EU, or what would become the EU. This is a different angle, which may explain also why, as seen from the US and from the perspective of US players or actors, France's policies were not, let's say, adequate. And this, of course, made its way into the historiography. Now, Mitterrand probably made things worse by not holding a very emotional, visible speech on German unification or German unity during the crucial months of the fall of 1989. Now, I should hasten to add that Bush didn't either. But there you are. You have a superpower on the one hand, and you have a medium power on the other hand. You also have a specific Franco-German relationship, which probably did induce some in Germany, and in fact in France as well, to expect Mitterrand in such a historical moment to hold such an emotional speech. After all, there had been the Bundestag speech in 1983, which was very important for Kohl. There was the very strong image of Kohl and Mitterrand holding hands at Verdun in 1984. So the whole, choreography or symbolism of Franco-German relations, of course, could have led Mitterrand to hold a major emotional speech in favor of German unity. Well, he didn't, and I will explain why. But this clearly made it easier for stereotypes to appear during those crucial months. Among Germans, the stereotype of a France ever eager to control Germany, and in fact even to make sure Germany remains divided, if necessary by engaging in dialogue or in a alliance de revers with the Soviets. The very same thing happened in 1966 when de Gaulle went to Moscow. The Germans were convinced at the time that the major discussion between de Gaulle and his Soviet counterparts was making sure that Germany would remain divided. Well, not so, but they believed so. There was the impression. Only Adenauer understood it was not the case. But the others believed that, what is he going to do there in Moscow? Well, the same with Mitterrand. What is Mitterrand going to do with Gorbachev in Kiev early December 1989? What else, if not, keep the Germans under control? It also fed the American stereotype of a Gaullist France Mitterrand is a Gaullist without recognizing it, of a Gaullist France always eager to or ready to betray the Western alliance, betray NATO, and reach back channel agreements with the Soviets at the expense of Western solidarity. And the Americans believed the same thing in early spring 1990 when they thought Mitterrand was negotiating some kind of a deal on Germany that would not make for a completely integrated Germany in NATO with the Soviets. Well, not so either. But there was the perception. And of course, there was the British stereotype of a France always sharing Britain's, or at least the British leadership's, reluctance to see Germany become bigger and bigger and more influential. And therefore, Thatcher was probably convinced. In fact, she says as much in her memoir that Mitterrand agreed with her on the need to check the Germans. Well, things were much more complicated. But those stereotypes were strong, and the fact that Mitterrand didn't have this major speech, although he spoke clearly in favor of German unification, but didn't have this major emotional speech, made those stereotypes more convincing. There were also there was an element of tactics. The U.S. ambassador to Germany at the time, General Walters, during the early weeks of 1990, was very busy telling the press how bad the French were and how good the Americans were, using all sorts of illustrations. Well, it's the normal, play of international politics, but it did have, an impact on the press. Now, the other factor which plays a role in explaining the narrative, the negative narrative, is, of course, sources and the literature. Well, the literature, I don't need to dwell too much on it because you have understood that I see that literature as so far being mostly focused on the U.S., on the U.S. role, on the German role, on the Soviet role, with very little on France, and very little on Europe, by the way, on the European dimension of the end of the Cold War, which of course plays to the detriment of the French record. And whenever France is discussed in those narratives, it's usually with a large amount of bias and prejudices. But even more importantly, the sources. I've discussed the archives, but the archives have become available, let's say, about 10 years ago when I started working in them. Before those archives, they were sources documenting the French role in these events, which turned out to be extremely toxic sources, very misleading sources. And the key, let's say, intoxication comes from the so-called diary of Mitterrand's personal advisor, Jacques Attali, who produced 3 volumes of his diary covering the whole period from 1981 to 1991 at the Élysée, in which he presents that diary as a daily transposition of his thoughts or conversations, etc. Now, it turns out that, and this has been used as the major piece of evidence by all those interested in France's role until the archives became available. Now, for whoever has had access to the real archives, one understands the problem. Attali is a very brilliant man, but he is also very dishonest, and he's a plagiarizer. In fact, he has lost many trials because he has written many books, more books than any reasonable academic would write in his own life. And the suspicion of plagiarizing was of course, evidenced, and he'd lost many trials, many lawsuits because of this. Now, he did the same thing with Verbatim, his diary. Most of Verbatim are actually pieces of documents that are not his own, that are from his colleagues in the Élysée, and that he presents as his. And not only is he a plagiarizer, but he's also a very bad one at that, because some of the documents are simply badly copied. And in some instances, you see inversions of for example, in verbatims of discussions, inversions of the protagonists. For example, he publishes the very important conversation between Mitterrand and Gorbachev in late May 1990, which revolves around German NATO membership. And at some point, when you see the original document, which, by the way, is handwritten by Attali himself, well, it's the opposite. Gorbachev says, I mean, in the published diary, Mitterrand says, why not a French status for Germany in NATO, meaning a non-integrated status? And Gorbachev says, yeah, great idea, let's try. But the reality is very different. In the notes of Attali, it's the opposite. It's Gorbachev who says, "Why don't we settle on a French status for Germany in NATO, non-integrated?" And Mitterrand says, "No way. There's no way the Germans and the Americans are going to accept this, and even myself, I cannot defend it." So it's the exact opposite. So to give you an example of the toxicity of that source, when you look at Kohls Memoirs, which were published earlier in this decade, they are surprisingly harsh for Mitterrand. Much harsher, actually, than his early book, which he wrote with two journalists in the mid-1990s, Ich wollte Deutschland Heinheits. The parts of the memoirs by Kohl that deal with Mitterrand are very harsh, or rather harsh. And the reason is, when you look closely at the memoirs, he has entire paragraphs that are taken from Attali. And he writes things like, "I later understood or later discovered that blah, 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 Mitterrand was thinking along these lines." And he I don't know, the person who helped him writing his memoirs probably felt compelled to use Attali as a source. And in fact, it's a rather odd example of a secondary source that is toxic, making its way into a primary source. And this can be documented. So all of this explains why this very negative narrative has persisted so long. Now, why is this narrative wrong? Well, it's impossible to summarize all the findings of my book here, but let me say that none of the classical assertions that usually make for the case against Mitterrand's policies are substantiated by archival investigation. There are usually two main reproaches aimed at Mitterrand. And let me review these reproaches. First, Mitterrand was taken aback by what happened in 1989, and two, he tried to block it. Now, was Mitterrand taken aback by what happened in 1989? The answer is yes and no. If you look at let's say, the French and Mitterrand's perception of the German question in the long term, what is the status of the German question throughout the 1980s? I would say that Mitterrand is intellectually prepared to the events of 1989, much more than others. Certainly much more than his predecessors. His predecessor, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who believed that basically the German question was closed. He understood that it was very much an open question. There are fascinating pieces of evidence of this, discussions between Mitterrand and Kohl. First, Mitterrand and Schmidt in 1981, when Mitterrand says to Schmidt in September 1981, it will take a generation for the Soviets to loosen their grip over Germany, and then you will see German unification. And Schmidt, of course, says, "No way. I won't see it in my lifetime." Well, part of his response is disingenuous, of course. But part of it is probably true. He didn't believe in it. Whereas Mitterrand understood that the question was still open. In 1984, he tells Kohl, who is much more, of course, forthcoming in terms of thinking about German unification than Schmidt for party reasons and also personal reasons. But Mitterrand says, what is not impossible is possible, meaning German unification is not impossible, therefore it might happen. Now, in 1985, when Gorbachev comes to power, Mitterrand understands rather quickly, like Genscher, by the way, more than Kohl, I would think, that perestroika and the new thinking means a lot in terms of the German question. The German question is going to be open again. And Védrine, his diplomatic advisor, I think accurately describes Mitterrand's thinking around 1987. Later he was foreign minister in the late 90s. That Mitterrand understands the progressive reopening of the German question, even though he doesn't believe he will see the result of that. In fact, when he meets George H.W. Bush for the first time, when Bush was president in May 1989 in Kennebunkport, he says to Bush, who asks him what he thinks about the German question, that it will take a very long time because the Soviets still have a grip over Germany. But he did share a vision of German unification with others, with Willy Brandt. I think he was very close to the thinking of Willy Brandt, even though their personal relationship was not an easy one. He basically believed in Ostpolitik, that is the progressive rapprochement between East and West and the establishment of of an international context conducive to some form of German unification, not necessarily a state-like unification, but some form of German unification. And of course, let's not forget that Mitterrand, again, without really admitting so, clearly because of his own record of an opponent to de Gaulle, really had bought de Gaulle's line of overcoming Yalta and creating a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, at the heart of which would be the solution to the German problem. Mitterrand believed that was an important task, just as de Gaulle had believed so. So he was prepared intellectually. Now, did he foresee what happened in the fall of 1989? Of course not. Nobody did, and he didn't either. He thought it would take, again, when he met Bush in May, he thought it would take years, 10 years, before it happened. And most of the documents show that until late October, French diplomats think along the lines of a slow process that will eventually lead to German unification. Now, the second question. So he was taken aback in that sense by the acceleration of events in the fall. Now, did he try, or did French diplomacy try to respond to that acceleration of events by trying to block the process, or even only breaking the process? The answer is clearly no, I think. I haven't found a single document that would substantiate this notion. Now, it is true that Mitterrand and his officials would have preferred in late 89, early 90, a slower pace of events. And in fact, they said as much to their German counterparts. In that sense, there was no double game, no double Spiel, as Kohl wrote in his memoirs on the part of Mitterrand. He was very straightforward with the Germans, explained to Genscher 2 days after the 10-point speech by Kohl that there was a risk of going too fast. And in fact, Genscher agreed. This is going too fast. We have to try to control it. So he would have liked things to go slower. And in that sense, my sense is that he was not very different from the thinking in the White House. When you read Tom Blanton's account in the volume that he will present tomorrow, it's clear that many people, even in the White House, were uncomfortable with the pace of events. And in fact, Bush himself was trying to convey that message to Kohl. When you read carefully the transcript of their meeting in Brussels, I think it was December 4th or 5th, right after Malta, Bush makes the point to Kohl, Gorbachev is very nervous, he thinks you're going too fast. We have to find a way of moving forward, but also of conveying that things are not getting out of control. Clearly, Bush was elegantly trying to pass a message on to Kohl. Make sure you control this. And Mitterrand was certainly along these lines. But there was no attempt at pulling the brakes. None of the major events or facts that are usually used to build a case against Mitterrand are, again, substantiated by archival documents. The first of those facts is the meeting between Mitterrand and Gorbachev in Kiev on December 6th. Right after Malta, by the way, and whereas there is no questioning of Bush meeting Gorbachev, there is a lot of questioning of Mitterrand meeting Gorbachev. People forget that Mitterrand was the chairman of the EC at the time, and he thought that it was impossible to conceive of the events that were going on in Europe with the Malta meeting in the backdrop and no similar meeting between Western Europeans and the Soviets. So he thought, as the chairman of the EC, he had to meet Gorbachev and discuss these events. But in Kiev, there was no attempt on the part of Mitterrand to enroll Gorbachev on a policy of blocking German unification. None of the documents that have been released, either on the Soviet side or the French side, give credence to this. In fact, the opposite is true. When you read, for example, the account of the meeting between the French Foreign Minister Dumas and his Soviet counterpart Shevardnadze at the same time as Mitterrand and Gorbachev meet, it's the opposite. It's Shevardnadze who goes to Dumas and says, you have to help us stop this. You can't accept it. You French people will never accept a big Germany in Europe. And Dumas says, look, we're not in 1945. The Germans have a right to self-determination, and we are committed to the Franco-German relationship. There's nothing we can do to stop it. So it's the reverse, really, that happened in Kiev. The second event that is used against Mitterrand is his trip to the GDR. on 2022, December 1989, which is used as a proof that Mitterrand was playing games, trying to make the GDR exist for many years to come. Simply by visiting the GDR, Mitterrand was infusing new life to the GDR and therefore trying to slow, if not to stop, German unification. Well, people forget that when Mitterrand goes to Berlin and to Dresden in late December 1989, the GDR is still around, and many people believe it's going to be around for quite a while, even Kohl, until, in fact, his meeting in Dresden on the eve of Mitterrand's trip, when apparently he realized that German unification would come quickly. But even then, he believed it would take at least 5 or 10 years. So visiting East Germany didn't mean that you were against German unification, but simply that the GDR was going to be around for a while, and the unification of Germany would have to be negotiated between the two Germanys. It couldn't be an Anschluss or a takeover by the FRG. And in fact, when you look at Mitterrand's public appearances in East Germany, he speaks about self-determination and German unification to students who are not interested, by the way. And he discusses what will become the 2+4 process with East German leaders, saying German unification will have to be decided by the Germans, but also by the four powers, and we have to find a way. So it doesn't square here either. Now, there's the Thatcher case. There are meetings between Mitterrand and Thatcher on the margins of the EC meeting in Strasbourg in December, which appear rather dramatic, with Mitterrand and Thatcher engaging in a lunatic dialogue on the Germans, and they are back and everything. But clearly, it's Thatcher who holds this kind of discourse, and Mitterrand doesn't like to contradict her. But when you look at their other meeting, which is more crucial, in late January 1990, it's the same thing. Mitterrand comes to Thatcher comes to Mitterrand and says, "We have to stop it. The Germans are the Germans again," and she uses the H word, Hitler, and everything. And Mitterrand, he looks annoyed, but he says, "Look, there's not so much we can do. They have they have a right to self-determination, and we are not going to stop it. It would be foolish. It would be counterproductive. It won't happen." And she says, "But we have to use the four powers right." Mitterrand says, "But it's to no avail. It won't work." More fundamentally, they were in complete disagreement on the response. Thatcher believed that the response to German unification, which he disliked, was ganging up against the Germans, the French, the British, and the Soviets, trying to avoid it, to impede it, to block it. Mitterrand believed, and this is the crux of the matter, that the only thing that could be done in response to German unification was accelerate European unification, which of course Thatcher couldn't accept, because she hated European unification even worse than she disliked the Germans. So there was no entente cordiale between Mitterrand and Thatcher, only in her dreams. And in fact, it really shows in her memoirs and in the declassified documents, which, by the way, were written by Charles Powell, who has a record of her private secretary, who has a record of twisting the conversations, as is well known since the disclosure of the Chequers memorandum, in which he wrote a summary of a meeting between Thatcher and a bunch of colleagues, let's say, which was quite far from what these colleagues thought they had said to her. Now, did he try to use the four powers right against German unification? No, of course. It was very clear from the start that legally there was no using the four powers right against German unification, simply because there was no legal basis. The four powers right didn't say that the four powers had a right to oppose German unification. Quite on the contrary. The four powers right were about making unification possible. So at no point was that used as a tool to slow down, let alone to block things. So the bottom line, I think, was that, as Mitterrand said to Kohl in one of their meetings early January, he said and this was published early on in the volume of the Chancellery documents. Mitterrand says to Kohl very, very candidly, "If I were a German patriot, I would be for German unification immediately. But I'm not a German patriot, I'm a French patriot, and therefore I need to take into consideration France's and Europe's interests." And this is what his line was. So, if France's policy or Mitterrand's policy towards German unification was not one of delaying, let alone of blocking, what was it about? Well, it was clearly, and this is actually is what Mitterrand has always said, it was a policy of controlling and embedding German unification in a European and an international framework. It's enough to read one of the earliest, actually official declarations on German unification, which is one by Mitterrand, late July 1989, at a time when very few heads of state discussed German unification, certainly not Kohl himself, certainly not Bush. But on the 27th of July of 1989, Mitterrand gives an interview to four major European newspapers, leading newspapers, and he says something, by the way, which he has said for the past 2 or 3 years. He says that German unification is legitimate, quote unquote, provided it is done peacefully and democratically, quote unquote. And again, Mitterrand was the first statement to take such a clear stance in favor of German unification. Now, if you look at those words, they are very important. It is legitimate. That is exactly Mitterrand's line. It is legitimate. Of course, it sounds like laissez-faire. It sounds like a sort of tacit nihil obstat rather than an enthusiastic support. But it is clearly an acceptance, if not a tacit support of German unification, which relates back to my early question. Why was there no emotional speech by Mitterrand? Well, I think there was no emotional speech by Mitterrand because he believed that until Kohl hadn't done certain gestures that would make it clear that he understood that German unification had to be embedded in an international and European framework, he was not going to encourage it. And it didn't happen until February, when the 2+4 basically is decided upon. And by the way, the chronology here is very similar when you compare the U.S. diplomacy and the French diplomacy. As I understand the U.S. narrative, it's only really at Camp David when Kohl goes to see Bush late February that Bush is completely reassured that his key objective, that is keeping a unified Germany in NATO, will be accepted by Kohl. Before that, there are doubts. Won't the Germans make deals with the Soviets? Only at Camp David does Bush receive a very clear assurance on the part of Kohl that this will happen. Exactly at the same time, even a little bit before, on the 15th of February 1990, Mitterrand received the same assurances from Kohl on European construction. German unification is not going to stop, is not going to have the effect of stopping European construction, quite on the opposite. So there's a parallelism here between the U.S. German and the French German relationship. So if you look at the other two adverbs in that sentence, democratically and peacefully, well, democratically it meant that, again, this couldn't be a merger. It couldn't be a takeover of the GDR by the FRG. It would have to be a merger between two existing states, and Mitterrand's visit to the GDR is also a way of reminding the West Germans that the GDR was there and that it had to be a deal between the two Germanys. And in fact, when these Germans have pronounced democratically on their future, that is after March the 18th, the day of the elections in East Germany, Mitterrand becomes much more actually emotional in discussing German unification because he believes that this, let's say, democratic parameter has been fulfilled by those elections. And let's not forget that until very late on, nobody knew that that Kohl's party would make such a strong show of force in the election. And of course, the Social Democrats were much less enthusiastic about a quick unification. Now, peacefully, of course, is the most important adverb in that Mitterrand sentence. What did it mean? It meant that German unification had to be compatible with keeping the European balance and, of course, the requirement of international security. And this meant two things for Mitterrand, the European framework and international framework. The European framework, again, for him, the key to German unification, the key response was to make sure that European unification would proceed, that it would not stop as a result of German unification. And there were two important steps here. First, the Strasbourg European Council meeting under French chairmanship, presidency in December 1989, there was, for a few days, a sense of hesitation, as seen from Paris, on what Kohl was ready to do, on the major issue of the time, which was economic and monetary unification, which had been decided in principle earlier on as a result of Franco-German dealings in 1988 and 1989. Now Mitterrand wanted to have a strong commitment on the part of the 12, starting with the Germans, on the timetable for European economic and monetary unification. And Kohl was very evasive. He was evasive even before the fall of the wall, but clearly the fall of the wall made him even more evasive for obvious domestic reasons. He had elections looming in December 1990, and he knew that basically sacrificing the Deutschmark was not exactly a very popular thing. So he had his reasons, but Mitterrand was adamant that because of the looming German unification, there had to be a strong decision to do the EMU, which was the key element of European unification at the time. And he obtained it from Kohl in Strasbourg, and that was very important. And then in the spring of 1990, there was the I can't spend too much time here, but I'm happy to answer questions on this. The French and the Germans understand that EMU is not enough and that there is need for political unification. And this is what is decided upon at the EC meetings in Dublin in March, and then in June 1990, under Franco-German leadership, the decision to move toward not only an economic and monetary union, but a European Union as such, and that is, of course, the what leads to Maastricht 18 months later. So this was the major Mitterrandian, I would say, response to German unification and its challenge, that is accelerating European unification, and that was done in full agreement between Kohl and Mitterrand. Now, as to the international framework for German unification, the way the French saw this was exactly in line with what de Gaulle had said in 1959. Again, at the time, he was probably one of the first Western statesmen to lay out a framework for German unification, saying that, yes, it can happen, provided a few things are done. First, a complete, at the time it was a big thing, big issue, complete renouncement on the part of the Germans to nuclear weapons. Two, setting the issue of alliances. What do we do with the existing NATO and the Warsaw Pact? And three, the borders of Germany. Now, these items, these issues were more or less sensitive. The easiest one was the nuclear. Nobody believed that the Germans wanted to go nuclear. It was only a matter of finding the right legal and political choreography, which was done at the 2+4 agreement in Moscow in September 1990. More difficult, of course, was the question of the alliances. What do we do with NATO? What do we do with the Warsaw Pact? And here, of course, Mitterrand was in full agreement with the notion that emerged in early 1990 that Germany had to be a full member of NATO, but there had to be a compensation for the loss of the GDR territory, and therefore that the NATO integration system could not be advanced east of the Elbe River. And what is not known, and is becoming to be known, is that, in fact, during that famous conversation in Moscow on May the 25th, which was widely misinterpreted because of Italy, Mitterrand played an important role in convincing Gorbachev that there was no opposing a unified Germany in NATO. He didn't realize that at the time. He understood it later, and this was confirmed to me by Chernyaev himself, Gorbachev's advisor for international affairs. The case that Mitterrand made on that day, that even he, the leader of Gaullist France, not integrated in NATO, cannot make the case for a non-integrated Germany in NATO, meant for Gorbachev that there was no way to obtain that result, and that it was fanciful to believe that anything short of a full German membership in NATO would be acceptable to the Germans and the Westerners. So, and on borders, of course, if I just have 3 or 4 minutes, I'll try to make it short. On borders, of course, it was the major issue, major bone of contention, because Mitterrand was very vocal on the need for the Germans to recognize the Oder-Neisse line in advance of German unification. He was not, contrary to what the Germans perceived at the time, on the line of the Poles. His view was much more nuanced, and he didn't, for example, buy the Polish idea that the Germans had to actually sign a treaty even before unification. He understood that there was no way the Germans would accept it for legal and political reasons. In fact, he understood Kohl's conundrum and the difficulty of having the West German public opinion, especially on the right, accept the definitive loss of the territories. But he thought this was the touchstone of a German settlement that would be negotiated and not of a unilateral German unification. Therefore, there had to be legal language on the border. There had to be international agreement on the border. It couldn't be only a German acceptance, unilateral promise that they would never call it into question. Mitterrand didn't believe that the Germans would call it into question, but he wanted a political framework for this. Now, to finish, if I had to summarize what the main factors behind Mitterrand's attitude were, what were they? I said there was acceptance of German unification, if not tacit support. Why was there fundamental acceptance of German unification? Well, counterfactuals are very useful here. Ask yourself the question, could France and Mitterrand have opposed German unification? Well, think of the results. Think of the consequences. It would have done nothing short of calling into question what was the major axis of French foreign policy since 1950, since the Schuman Declaration, that is Franco-German reconciliation and European unification. It would have been folly for a French leader to oppose German unification. Why was the support not reluctant but tacit? Why was it not more emotional? Well, some people say because Mitterrand was born in 1916, he was impressed by, of course, the two world wars, and he still had a measure of, let's say, resentment against Germany. I think this interpretation is not very valid. After all, Mitterrand had come of age and had become a major politician after the war, within that generation of French politicians who had made the overcoming of the Franco-German hatred a major priority. And all his political life had been, basically devoted to that. So I think what is more interesting in Mitterrand and people of his generation was not so much whatever remained of the resentments, but in fact their ability to overcome it. Now, I think he had three priorities. First, he didn't want a repeat of history. He frequently talks about a return to 1913 during those months, by which he means that if the end of the Cold War and German unification are not dealt with in a controlled fashion, then there is a risk of the return of nationalism, of hatred, of all sorts of phenomena that had led Europe to two world wars. In fact, he shared this view with the other major players, whether Bush or Kohl or Gorbachev himself. The second priority was to protect Gorbachev, whom he believed was so to say, the alpha and the omega of what happened. The end of the Cold War and German unification was unthinkable without Gorbachev, without what Gorbachev had done since 1985. And there was a risk, if things went too quickly or went uncontrolled, for Gorbachev's survival. And in fact, he was not off mark when you think of it. The attempted coup of the summer of 1991 can be explained to a large extent by the pace of events in Eastern Europe. Finally, of course, and I stop there, his priority was building a post-Cold War, a post-Yalta Europe, in which he believed the European community, soon to be the European Union, had to be the keystone. And in fact, when you think of it today, the EU is the keystone of the European architecture. Thank you. Sorry for being a bit long.
Could I begin the discussion by asking you just very briefly to say a word? You began and ended with de Gaulle, actually, with the initial purpose of the Union and Mitterrand's making sense of it in the end. I'm quite struck with the continuity of Mitterrand's thought. but I wonder what he himself made of the Gaullist legacy, what did he think of it? In other words, at one point you have him say that I am a French patriot, I am upholding French interests. On the other hand, he had to deal with the suspicion that France might, as previously, pull out of NATO.
No, I think it's puzzling, of course, especially for a man who was de Gaulle's direct opponent in the 60s and has always been very critical of him. But he clearly admired him a lot, especially his foreign policy. And it was clear ever since he came to the Élysée in '81 that he would take over the Gaullist legacy, whether in terms of the need to defend national independence, nuclear weapons, etc. That clearly was a part of the legacy that Mitterrand wanted to pick up. Building a strong Europe was also something that was at the core of the de Gaulle agenda, and which Mitterrand picked up. And in fact, he did this with Kohl. And finally, overcoming Yalta, this notion that you have to build a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals and gradually erase, the Cold War divide was also at the core of the Gaullist legacy, and Mitterrand picked it up very keenly, very early on. So there was a complete continuity, frankly, on these issues.
Very interesting. David?
One issue which I think something that I think really hurt Mitterrand's perception the perception of Americans towards him, damaged the way he was viewed in the United States, were the rumors and stories that came out about his activities during the Vichy period.
Oh.
And I wonder whether you think that has influenced the historiography very much.
Yeah, that's an issue. It probably did, although those rumors really surfaced very late in the day. I mean, it all really appeared in 94, 95. And actually, they were not rumors, they were facts. The problem with those facts is that Mitterrand never really acknowledged them. Although it was a rather banal situation for a Frenchman in his early 20s to first go to Vichy and see what happened there, especially because he came from the right originally. After he was released from Germany, or he actually escaped from Germany, to see what was happening in Vichy and whether he could make a career there. And somewhere around 1942, partly because he didn't like it, partly because he was seeing that the tide was being reversed, and after Stalingrad even more so, going to the resistance. I mean, there were tens and tens of French people who did this. But of course, Mitterrand never really recognized this, part of it probably because he was facing de Gaulle. And it was hard to make any concessions on the personal history. The only thing that he said about this one day was, on the 18th of June 1940, when de Gaulle made his famous London appeal, Mitterrand said I was a prisoner in Germany, meaning I couldn't be an early resistant. But so he didn't admit those facts. But so it turned against him, basically. But his itinerary was not really very different from that of other respectable politicians. Now, did it play a role in the historiography? Yes, in the sense that, especially in France, what shouldn't have been revelations, because all this was well known again, turned into a very harsh condemnation of the whole Mitterrand record late in the presidency. After 2 7-year terms, the man was really worn out. He was also very sick. And all of it, combined to make a very dismal end of the Mitterrand presidency. And so everything was, included in those criticisms. And in fact, there was a contradiction, because if really Mitterrand was a Vichyist and a collaborationist, he should have applauded to German unification, not oppose it. So there was a contradiction in those criticisms. But yes, it did play a role in, let's say, in the atmosphere, probably more in France than elsewhere, in fact, in the atmosphere that was the backdrop against which the first books were written. I think so.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more? You mentioned that you thought, that you thought that Mitterrand was probably closer to Genscher in his view of unification. Could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, Mitterrand was a socialist, right, or social democrat?
Well, nominally he was, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, would that have predisposed him to be more? And Genscher is a free democrat, right? So, I mean, where were in terms of domestic policy, and I mean, what was Mitterrand's vision of what post-unification Germany would look like, and was it that one of the reasons that he might have opposed it?
I think party lines don't play a big role here. It's really a matter of personalities, and yes, of course, Genscher was a liberal, although the liberals at the time were different from the liberals today in Germany. So probably Genscher was a bit closer ideologically to Mitterrand than Kohl, but that was not the major, I think, factor. The major factor was on the German side. I mean, of course, I'm not a German expert, but clearly there was a rivalry between Genscher and Kohl. And Genscher was the foreign minister. He believed there was need for an international framework for all this. Kohl was the chancellor. He wanted to be the chancellor of unity. So they basically disagreed on this. And of course, the rivalry made that even worse. Mitterrand and Genscher agreed because both shared the notion that this couldn't be a unilateral process, that there had to be an international framework. And in fact, Genscher's vision of German unification was very close to Brandt's, which was inherited from his own Ostpolitik and from the SPD line, again, with the consideration for the international framework, the European framework. So for these reasons, Mitterrand and Genscher were probably closer initially than Kohl and Mitterrand.
Yes, Dan.
I may have asked this question last time you appeared here, but I forgot what your answer was if I did, so I'm not embarrassed to ask it again.
Repetition.
And that is, was there any polling both before and after the fall of the wall of French citizens and their attitudes towards reunification, and to what extent was Mitterrand's pronouncements in sync with that or at odds with that?
Yeah, I should have mentioned this, but it's a very important point. The answer is very clear. The French were massively in favor of German unification. It was never less than 70% in favor, starting right after the fall of the wall. 70% in favor. And also, when asked the question, do you see German unification as compatible with European unification, they said yes. And this explains the first answer. So when you look at the figures, here again, the parallelism between the US and the French situation is very close. The French public is very, very much supportive of German unification, more than the rest of European public opinions. And of course, this is the result of 40 years of Franco-German reconciliation and European construction. So it did play a role. And there's no doubt that if Mitterrand had played an obstructive policy, he would have been met with skepticism on the part of the French.
Yes.
Thank you. What is your view of the role of European institutions themselves in this framework of French policy, and which is probably a role which is a little neglected by what you would call, the traditional narratives of the end of the Cold War?
Yeah. No, I think it's a major. I mean, if you let's say European process in general, not just institutions, but if you mean institutions in a very specific term, then one has to mention the fact that the chairman of the Commission then was Jacques Delors, and Jacques Delors, of course, a Frenchman, which was picked by Mitterrand and Kohl in '85 to become the chairman of the Commission. Delors was very much in favor of German unification, and the relationship between Kohl and Delors was actually much better than between Delors and Mitterrand. So in that sense, the Commission under Delors was very favorable to German unification and tried to make it happen in a constructive fashion. But more generally, if your question is more general, and if it deals with the impact of the European process, European construction process, I think it's a major impact, not only on German unification, actually, but on the end of the Cold War as a whole. And here I have my my skepticism or my doubts with the dominant narrative, which is mainly Soviet American. But when you look at things from very closely, many of the things that happened in '89 or in the run-up to '89 would not have happened without the European construction. If you look at events in Poland, for example, it's very clear that the evolution of the liberalization of Poland under Jaruzelski at the end of the '80s had much more to do with European incentives than American pressure. Probably the same in the rest of Eastern Europe. When you look at West German policies, it's very clear that they would have been very different without the shield of European construction. So that also played a very important role. So I would here, make the case for a much more significant taking into account of that dimension in all the events, not only in the management of the events, but in fact in what triggered those events. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes.
Maybe we collect some questions.
I think that would be a good idea. Could we collect some questions, and 3 or 4 questions, and we'll ask Professor Bozo to reply.
You talked about most of the dominant players really underestimated the pace. Why do you think that, and was there in the archives any analysis afterwards of how come they all missed this major thing of happening?
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Mitterrand saw sort of like his philosophical concept of the right moment in history, because it seems that, from what you're saying, is he's not opposed to German unification. It just doesn't necessarily see it as something that should happen, fast, and that is the particular right time. While Kohl, I think, understood, and in my perspective correctly understood, that if it doesn't happen then, it might take, as Mitterrand sort of thought, 10 to 15 years for it to happen if it actually happened. So how did he see that? Did he have a concept of like the right moment in time, the right moment in history, and how did he see that happening?
All the way in the back.
Right.
Yes, I have just a bit of follow-up to Sonia's question about the domestic side, and maybe it really has more to do not with the run-up to unification, but that period from '89 to Maastricht '92. And just wondered what Mitterrand and Delors' view was of the actual process, since they had said, Mitterrand had said, it had to be democratic, since there were those questions about how the actors in the DDR who had been wanting to see some more input from the East German side into the social arrangements afterwards. Was there any kind of interaction on that whole question on the part of Mitterrand and Delors?
All the way in the back, and then one here.
Your fascinating story is mostly about Mitterrand and Kohl, and I wanted to ask you whether your research in the French archive changes what we know about Thatcher, Gorbachev, and Bush, and their respective role in this. And also a smaller question, which is about the politics of not knowing about Mitterrand's role in German reunification. So why is it that for the first 15 years after reunification, his role was not widely appreciated? Why is it that Attali is falsifying the record? Are there any domestic political reasons in France for that?
I think that gives you
Maybe have one more, and then we'll have the last one.
Okay.
The portrait of Mitterrand you put forward as someone who saw no contradiction between German reunification and European unification, and as a way of taking advantage of the historical timing to reverse the Cold War and the division of Europe. Does this have any implications for the 1955 agreement neutralizing Austria? And one of which provisions I understand is that Austria would never be a part of Germany. Or am I misinterpreting it? Certainly after World War I, Austria was the one case where the Wilsonian idea of national self-determination was declared off bounds. Austria was not allowed to unify with Germany.
But that's a full
Yes.
plate, right?
Wow.
A marathon opportunity.
On the Austrian precedent, or I'm not sure it's a very significant issue here because, I mean, Austria in 1989 or in 1955 was not Austria in 1920 anyway, or even in 1914. So, again, the major issue was Germany itself. That there was no contradiction between German unification and European unification was the mantra of French and German leaders ever since Adenauer and Schuman and de Gaulle. I mean, these people kept on saying this in bilateral meetings between, again, Schuman and Adenauer in the early 50s, de Gaulle and Adenauer in the 60s, and Kohl and Mitterrand in the early 80s. German unification will be made under a German roof. There can be no German unification without a European unification. Whether they believed it or not, they had said it so often and so much, and it was so embedded in their mutual policies that there was no way they could do otherwise in 1989 than, you know, realizing that the moment had come to put flesh on the bones and to transform a theory into practice. So, you know, what was tricky between Mitterrand and Kohl, between France and Germany, was not the theory, was not the model. The model was, again, the Schuman-Adenauer model, that is, a German unification under a European roof. The problem was how you do it. How do you do it in practice? And this is where statesmanship was very important. But the path was very clear, I think, and there was never any doubt, frankly, on the part of the French that the Germans would renounce European unification. I don't think there really was any doubt at the time on the part of Kohl and on the Germans that the French would want to oppose German unification. But the problem was, how do you make this work in practice? We've said it so often and often, again and again. Let's make it work now. And that was, you know, the difficulty between, let's say, early December, the Strasbourg meeting, and March or late spring 1990. On the need for the process to be democratic, I think you have to maybe I misunderstood your question, but you have to distinguish between German unification and European unification. It was clear for the French, but I'm sure also for the others, that there had to be a democratic pronouncement on the part of these Germans on what they wanted to do. It was not a foregone conclusion. Again, most outside powers, including the U.S., vastly misread the East German situation in the fall of 1989. All the Western diplomats in East Berlin spent much too much time with the institutional opposition, the evangelists and the others who are not interested in German unification. And they don't realize that there is a wave under all this that it will take over the East German situation in January, February 1990. And there will be a disconnect between this, as Mary Sarati shows very well in her book, or Andreas Röder in his book. There will be a split between the institutional opposition and the wider public, which really is interested in unification, mostly for material reasons, by the way. But this is misunderstood or underestimated until very late in the day by all actors, I would say including Kohl himself, until late 1990. There was a question on, sorry, who asked a question about how Thatcher, Gorbachev, and the others emerged? Yes, hi. Yes, on Thatcher, it's predictable what you see in the French archives. They clearly, I mean, they don't spend too much time, you know, discussing her anti-German feelings because they're so well known that it doesn't even deserve that. But for example, there is a very funny diplomatic dispatch by the French ambassador in London in March 1990, who had invited Thatcher to dinner. And he describes the conversation. And Thatcher says things like, you believe you will embed a united Germany in European construction, but it will be the opposite. Germany will dominate European construction, et cetera, et cetera. So it's colorful, but not very significant. What is more important is the political impasse between the Brits and the French. And as usual, the impasse is European unification. There's a very clear discussion of this between Dumas and Douglas Hurd in February, right after the meeting between Thatcher and Mitterrand of late January, when Thatcher says to Mitterrand, well, at least let's have the two ministers discuss this, because Mitterrand says no to everything. And so Mitterrand says yes. And so Dumas and Hurd meet 3 weeks later. And Dumas says, well, we have to face the fact that European unification is a thing of the past, and it's going to be even more dangerous if Germany becomes united. And Dumas says, no way. This is our policy. So this was the major. I mean, there was never any agreement possible between Thatcher and Mitterrand because of this. On Gorbachev, of course, he's a very central character in these archives, and I won't dwell on this. I mean, he's the major figure for Mitterrand. I mean, without Gorbachev, nothing would happen. On Bush, it's an interesting relationship. They had a very good relationship. They liked each other. Mitterrand and Bush had established a very trusting relationship very early on when Bush was vice president. He had come to see Mitterrand in June 1981, right after his election, and right before Mitterrand would set up his first government with 4 communist ministers, which was not to the liking of Washington. And Bush expressed those concerns, and Mitterrand said, be reassured, they will be trapped into this. The communists will be in the government. They will have to be in agreement with my policies, which are Cold War policies, and in 10 years' time, there will be no longer any communist party in France. And Bush remembered that 10 years later or 8 years later, when he saw that the Communist Party had in fact completely almost disappeared from the scene. So there was a trusting relationship. But what appears from the French archive is to the advantage of Bush in the sense that he was seen as a very reasonable and intelligent leader. But as appears in one of the documents of the Blanton-Sevranskaya book, I think Mitterrand confides to Gorbachev right after the meeting in Kennebunkport in May 1989 about Bush. Bush is a very good man. He has one problem: he has no vision. And of course, it echoes the vision thing. But Mitterrand believed that Bush didn't really. I mean, the Americans didn't really have a vision of post-Cold War Europe, except for the maintenance of a NATO-centered system. And in a sense, he was right. Now, I think Blanton goes too far in minimizing the importance of U.S. diplomacy, because the NATO side of the equation was very important. And it was a major piece of statesmanship to have the Soviets agree to that. But what transpires from the French archives on Bush is this. They don't have a concept for the future. So they hold to things of the past. What Sarati aptly calls the prefab model, that is the notion that you're going to apply prefabs to the post-Yalta Europe, and that is basically NATO. In fact, the French were doing the same with the EU, but they believed that the EU was a thing of the future, not a thing of the past. The Mitterrand, the right moment in history, that's a long, complex question. One of Mitterrand's favorite, one word, one of Mitterrand's favorite mantra was, you have to give time. You never have enough time. So he certainly believed that was the case. But again, this was until the fall of the wall. After the fall of the wall, he understands, I mean, as everyone. But before that, again, Willy Brandt has the same notion that it will take 20 years, and you will have a slow convergence. You will avoid, traumas and catastrophes by doing it in a controlled way. But then after that, he stops asking himself, do I like it or not? Do I want it to happen or not? It doesn't make any sense for a politician or a statesman. Finally, there was one last question. May I just address Joseph's question? I'm sorry, I can't reread myself. What was in one word? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I think the previous answer is the response, because all of them thought that it would take so much time to achieve this. and that the Cold War was such a durable thing that nobody could believe it would be either it would end dramatically and quickly, or it would end peacefully and in a very long period. But nobody believed that the quick and peaceful was possible.
We don't want to bring the discussion to a close, but we want to urge you to continue it over wine and cheese. In the meantime, we want to give our speaker.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, sir.
Since it was mentioned here many times, let me also announce that tomorrow at Tuesday, December 21st, between 4 and 5:30, you have the Plantan Safranskaya book introduction, also on 89 with declassified Soviet European documents. So if you want to come back, you're very welcome. Okay, and thank you again. It was fascinating. We could go on for hours here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's why.